Margaret Crosby stood in the library of Riverside Plantation on the morning of March 3, 1859, holding a document that would either destroy her family's legacy or force her to become a monster. And after reading it 3 times with increasing horror, she made a decision that would haunt American courts for the next 165 years. She would erase 23 human beings from existence before they could claim what her husband's will promised them. The children ranged in age from 2 to 19 years old, all living in the slave quarters behind the main house, all carrying her late husband's blood in their veins, mixed with the African heritage of their mothers, and all legally entitled to divide among themselves an estate worth $3 million in today's currency, while Margaret's 3 legitimate white sons would inherit only the manor house and family name. Her husband Henry had been dead for 6 days when she lit the first candle that would illuminate the darkest chapter of her life. And by the time she extinguished it 12 hours later, she had designed a plan so methodical in its cruelty that even hardened slave traders would later refuse to speak about it publicly. Henry Crosby had been 51 years old when a heart attack killed him in his study while reviewing plantation accounts. He had built Riverside into one of South Carolina's most profitable tobacco operations, controlling 4,200 acres worked by 300 enslaved people, with additional investments in cotton processing, riverboat transport, and Charleston real estate. His wealth placed him among the state's elite planter class, the men who shaped politics and set social standards for everyone beneath them. But Henry had maintained secrets that his wife discovered only after his death. The will, sealed and held by his attorney Thomas Whitfield until Henry's passing, contained provisions that Margaret had never suspected during 26 years of marriage. Henry acknowledged paternity of 23 children born to enslaved women on his plantation between 1840 and 1857. He provided detailed documentation, names, birth dates, mothers' identities, physical descriptions, and he structured an inheritance that treated these children as legitimate heirs despite their legal status as property. The will specified that each of the 23 children would receive equal shares of Henry's business holdings, land outside the plantation proper, and liquid assets held in Charleston banks. The distribution would occur when each child reached age 21 or in 1870, whichever came first. Until then, a trust administered by Whitfield would manage the assets and ensure the children received education and training appropriate to their future station as property owners. Margaret's 3 white sons, Robert, James, and William, ages 24, 22, and 18, would inherit Riverside Plantation itself, including the main house, operational buildings, and current slave holdings. They would also receive the Crosby name, social standing, and political connections their father had cultivated. But the bulk of Henry's actual wealth, the investments and land that generated cash income, would go to children who could not legally own property under South Carolina law because their mothers had been enslaved. The legal mechanism Henry employed was complex, but valid. He had quietly manumitted each of the 23 children years before his death, filing paperwork that freed them while keeping them physically on the plantation under his guardianship. This gave them legal standing to inherit, despite their mixed race. South Carolina law allowed free people of color to own property with certain restrictions, and Henry's will exploited those provisions to transfer wealth to children the state would have preferred to keep in bondage. Margaret understood immediately what this inheritance meant. Her sons would become poor relations managing a plantation for wages, while their mixed-race half-siblings controlled the family fortune. The social humiliation would be catastrophic. No white family in Charleston would associate with the Crosbys. Her sons would be unmarriageable. The family name her husband had spent decades building would become synonymous with miscegenation and racial betrayal. She met with Thomas Whitfield 4 days after Henry's funeral. The attorney, a thin man in his 60s, with abolitionist sympathies he rarely voiced publicly, explained that Henry had drafted the will 5 years earlier and updated it annually as new children were born. Henry had discussed his intentions with Whitfield extensively, making clear that he felt moral obligation to provide for all his children, regardless of their mother's race or status. Margaret asked the question that mattered. "Can this will be contested?" Whitfield replied with lawyerly precision. "You can challenge it in court." But Henry was mentally competent when he drafted it. He updated it regularly. The manumission papers are properly filed. Unless you can prove fraud or coercion, which you cannot, the will stands. What if the children cannot be located by 1870? Whitfield consulted the document. Then their shares revert to your sons as residual heirs. But all 23 live on Riverside currently. Locating them will not be difficult. Margaret nodded and left his office, her face composed, but her mind calculating possibilities that Whitfield's legal expertise had accidentally revealed. If the children disappeared, if they could not be found and identified by the deadline, the fortune would return to her family. South Carolina law required physical presence to claim inheritance. Freed people of color had no legal protection if they were sold out of state before claiming their rights. Over the next 2 months, Margaret executed her plan with systematic efficiency that suggested she had been planning it since the moment she finished reading Henry's will. She contacted slave traders in Charleston, Augusta, and Richmond, men who specialized in acquiring inventory for distant markets, where questions about paperwork were rarely asked. She provided them with detailed descriptions of each child, their approximate ages, and instructions that they be separated and sold to buyers in different states under different names. The traders asked no questions about why a wealthy widow wanted to sell manumitted free people of color. They assumed financial necessity or personal vendetta, and they charged premium prices for the discretion Margaret required. Each child would be sold with forged documentation showing them as property purchased from other sources, erasing any connection to Riverside Plantation or the Crosby name. The sales began in May 1859. Margaret called the children to the main house individually, telling each that their mother had been sold away and they were being sent to join her. The younger ones believed this and went quietly. The older ones, particularly 19-year-old Sarah and 16-year-old Isaac, protested and had to be subdued by overseers before being loaded into wagons that would carry them to auction blocks in distant cities. Sarah, the eldest, was sold in Houston, Texas, to a cotton planter who needed household staff. Isaac went to New Orleans, purchased by a sugar plantation owner looking for field hands. 8-year-old Hannah was sold in Richmond, Virginia. The 2-year-old Elijah was sold in Mobile, Alabama, under the name James Anderson, too young to remember his real identity or origin. The twins, Thomas and Mary, age 12, were deliberately separated despite their pleas to stay together. Thomas went to a tobacco farm in Kentucky. Mary was sold to a Charleston family, ironically located just 30 miles from Riverside, though she would never know how close she remained to her birthplace. By September 1859, all 23 children had been removed from South Carolina and sold under false identities to buyers who had no knowledge of their true parentage or their legal status as freed people with inheritance rights. Margaret destroyed the plantation birth records that documented their existence. She burned letters and personal items that might connect them to the Crosby family. She intimidated the enslaved mothers into silence by threatening to sell them as well if they spoke about their missing children. Thomas Whitfield learned of the disappearances in October when he visited Riverside to check on the children as the will required him to do quarterly. Margaret informed him calmly that the children had been moved to other properties for their safety and education, which was within her authority as temporary guardian until the trust took full effect. Whitfield was suspicious, but had no legal grounds to demand more information. The children were legally free, and Margaret, as their guardian, could relocate them as she saw fit. But Whitfield was not stupid, and he understood what Margaret had likely done. Before confronting her directly, he made copies of every document related to Henry's will and the children's manumission papers. He recorded the names, descriptions, approximate ages, and mothers' identities in a separate journal that he kept in his office safe. And he began making quiet inquiries with contacts in other cities about unusual sales of freed children from South Carolina to out-of-state buyers. The evidence he gathered confirmed his worst suspicions. Margaret had sold all 23 children into effective re-enslavement under false identities, scattering them across 8 states to ensure they could never be found and identified before the 1870 deadline. It was brilliant in its ruthlessness and perfectly legal, because South Carolina courts would never prosecute a white woman for selling free people of color. Even if those people had inheritance rights, she was deliberately trying to eliminate. Whitfield faced an impossible choice. He could expose Margaret's scheme, but doing so would require accusing a prominent white widow of fraud based solely on circumstantial evidence and his own suspicions. He could try to locate the children, but he had no authority to compel slave traders to reveal buyer information. And searching across 8 states would take years he did not have. Or he could wait, preserve his documentation, and hope that future circumstances might create an opportunity to restore justice. He chose to wait. He secured his copies of the will and supporting documents in a safe deposit box at a Charleston bank with instructions that they be preserved indefinitely. He continued serving as trust administrator, managing Henry's assets for the absent heirs, while Margaret and her sons lived comfortably on the plantation. And he watched as tensions between North and South escalated toward the war that everyone knew was coming, but nobody wanted to name. By the time Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, Margaret Crosby believed she had won. The children were scattered, untraceable, living under false names with no knowledge of their true identities or the fortune they had lost. The deadline was still 9 years away, and even if by some impossible chance 1 or 2 were eventually found, the other 21 shares would revert to her sons, preserving most of the Crosby wealth where Margaret believed it belonged. She did not know that Thomas Whitfield had spent 2 years building a network of abolitionist contacts across the South, who would help him search for the missing heirs once the chaos of war created opportunities that peacetime never allowed. She did not know that some of the children were old enough to remember their real names and their mothers' faces despite the years and the distance. And she did not know that her own actions had created a mystery that would obsess historians for more than a century after her death. A story of wealth and race and justice denied that would eventually reach courtrooms she could never have imagined. The war was coming, and with it, Thomas Whitfield's chance to find the 23 heirs that Margaret Crosby had tried to erase from history. Sarah Crosby was standing in a cotton field outside Houston, Texas, on a suffocating August afternoon in 1863, when she heard the news that would transform her from property into a weapon, though she would not understand the full implications until 2 years later when a stranger arrived, asking questions that no one had dared ask since the day Margaret Crosby sold her away from the only home she had ever known. The Union Army had occupied New Orleans and was pushing deeper into Texas, and the white family who owned Sarah, or believed they owned her, since the paperwork Margaret had provided was fraudulent, and Sarah was legally free under South Carolina law, was panicking about losing their investment in human beings when emancipation came. But what made Sarah's heart race was not the prospect of freedom that every enslaved person whispered about in quarters after dark, but rather the Union officer who had been seen in Houston asking specific questions about displaced people from South Carolina, particularly those sold between 1859 and 1860, particularly those who might have connections to prominent planter families. Sarah knew immediately who he was looking for and why, because she had never forgotten the name her father had given her, or the face of the white woman who had looked her in the eyes while lying about where she was being sent. Thomas Whitfield had waited 2 years after Fort Sumter to begin his search in earnest. The early war years were consumed with survival and adaptation as South Carolina transformed into a Confederate state, and his abolitionist sympathies became dangerous to express publicly. He maintained his position as trust administrator for the Crosby estate, managing investments and filing required reports while Margaret and her sons contributed money and supplies to the Confederate cause. Robert Crosby, the eldest son, had joined a South Carolina regiment and was serving in Virginia. The younger sons managed Riverside Plantation with increasing difficulty as Union blockades strangled Southern commerce. Whitfield used the chaos of war to his advantage. He corresponded with abolitionist networks in the North, providing them with information about Southern military preparations, while gathering intelligence about slave sales and displaced freed people in border states. He made contact with Union officers involved in processing contraband, the term the Army used for escaped slaves who fled to federal lines seeking protection. These officers maintained records of refugees, recording names, origins, and family connections that might help reunify people separated by slavery. In the spring of 1863, Whitfield received authorization from the Union Army to travel into occupied territories as a legal advisor, helping freed people establish their status and claim property rights. His real mission, known only to a handful of senior officers who understood the political value of documenting Confederate wealth for future confiscation, was to locate the 23 Crosby heirs before the 1870 deadline expired. If even a few could be found, and their identities proven, the legal claim to Henry Crosby's fortune would transfer from Margaret's Confederate supporting sons to freed people who the Union could position as proof that slavery corrupted family bonds, and that emancipation would restore natural justice. Whitfield began his search methodically, targeting the cities where he knew Margaret had sold the children based on fragmentary records he had obtained from reluctant slave traders who feared Union prosecution. Houston was his third stop after inconclusive inquiries in New Orleans and Mobile. He carried with him copies of the original manumission papers, descriptions of each child, and a letter signed by a Union general granting him authority to interview any person of color who might have information relevant to Confederate property seizures. Sarah heard about the Union officer asking questions from another woman in the quarters who had been in Houston's Market District when Whitfield began showing people a list of names and descriptions. The woman could not read, but she remembered one name because it sounded similar to her own daughter's. Sarah, approximately 19 years old when sold in 1859, from a South Carolina plantation, light-skinned with gray eyes inherited from her father. Sarah made a decision that required courage she did not know she possessed. She walked away from the cotton field in the middle of the workday, ignored the overseer's shouted threats, and headed toward Houston on foot. She had no pass, no authorization to leave the property, and she knew that if she was caught she would be whipped or worse. But she also knew that this might be her only chance to reclaim the identity and the future that Margaret Crosby had stolen from her 4 years earlier. She found Whitfield 2 days later at a Union Army headquarters established in a confiscated hotel. The guards initially refused to let her enter, but she persisted until a sympathetic lieutenant agreed to ask if the legal advisor would speak with a woman who claimed to be from South Carolina. Whitfield emerged within minutes, took one look at Sarah's face, and said the first words anyone had spoken to her in years that acknowledged who she really was. "You are Henry Crosby's daughter. I can see him in your eyes." Sarah spent 6 hours that afternoon telling Whitfield everything she remembered. Her childhood at Riverside Plantation, her mother Rebecca, who had worked in the main house and had whispered to Sarah that her father was the master himself, which Sarah did not understand until she was old enough to see that her skin was lighter than other children's, and her eyes were gray instead of brown. The day, in May 1859, when Margaret Crosby had called her to the big house and told her that her mother had been sold to Alabama and that Sarah would be sent to join her, which Sarah had believed until she arrived in Houston and realized the lie. The years since then, working fields and enduring treatment that denied her any acknowledgement of her intelligence or her true status as a freed person with rights under South Carolina law. Whitfield documented everything in detailed notes. He compared Sarah's memories to his records and confirmed matches on every significant detail. He explained to her that she was legally free, that her father had manumitted her years before his death, and that she was entitled to inherit a substantial portion of the Crosby estate if she could be located and identified before 1870. He also warned her that Margaret Crosby had sold all 23 heirs with the specific intention of preventing them from claiming their inheritance, which meant that Margaret might take additional steps to ensure Sarah never reached South Carolina alive if she learned that Sarah had been found. Sarah's response was immediate and uncompromising. "I want what is mine, and I want to find my brothers and sisters who do not know who they are." Whitfield had found his first heir, but he knew that locating 22 others scattered across a continent torn by civil war would require resources and time he did not have. He made arrangements for Sarah to remain under Union Army protection in occupied Houston while he continued his search. He provided her with copies of her manumission papers and a notarized statement documenting her identity and her claim to the Crosby inheritance. And he sent a carefully worded letter to Margaret Crosby in South Carolina, informing her that one of her late husband's heirs had been located and that legal proceedings to enforce the will would commence at the appropriate time. Margaret received the letter in October 1863. Her response was swift and calculated. She hired private detectives to locate the other missing heirs before Whitfield could find them. She instructed these men, former slave catchers who now worked for Confederate families trying to prevent property loss, to use whatever methods necessary to ensure that anyone they located would be unable or unwilling to come forward with claims against the Crosby estate. The race that followed would claim lives, separate families, and expose the depths of depravity that the inheritance system encouraged when combined with racial hatred and desperation to preserve wealth. Whitfield was searching to restore justice. Margaret was hunting to eliminate threats. And the 23 heirs, most of whom did not know they were heirs at all, found themselves caught in a deadly game they had not chosen to play. Isaac Crosby, 16 when sold to a Louisiana sugar plantation in 1859, had survived to age 20 by working brutal harvest cycles and avoiding the attention of overseers who viewed enslaved workers as disposable labor, easily replaced. In 1863, he escaped to Union lines and joined a Louisiana Native Guard regiment, one of the first African-American units allowed to fight for the Union. He was stationed near Port Hudson when he received a message from a Union officer asking if he had any connection to a plantation called Riverside in South Carolina, or a family named Crosby. Isaac had never forgotten his real name or his origins, despite 4 years of being called by the false name his Louisiana owner had assigned him. He confirmed his identity and agreed to meet with Whitfield, who was traveling through Louisiana gathering testimony from freed people. The meeting was scheduled for December 15, 1863, at a Union garrison 10 miles from Isaac's unit. Isaac never arrived. His body was found 3 days later in a bayou, shot twice in the back. The official investigation ruled it an unfortunate encounter with Confederate guerrillas who frequently attacked isolated Union soldiers. But Whitfield knew better. The timing was too precise, the target too specific. Someone had intercepted Isaac before he could provide his statement and eliminated him to prevent his claim to the Crosby inheritance. It was the first death that could be directly attributed to Margaret's hunters, but it would not be the last. The war had created an environment where murder could be disguised as combat casualty, where witnesses were scarce and investigations cursory. Margaret had chosen her weapon carefully, and she was using it with ruthless efficiency. By the end of 1864, Whitfield had located 7 of the 23 heirs. Sarah in Texas was cooperating fully. 3 others in border states had provided statements but were too frightened to leave their locations. 2 had died of natural causes before Whitfield reached them. And Isaac had been murdered. The remaining 16 were still missing, their identities lost in the chaos of war and displacement. The deadline was 6 years away, but Whitfield understood that time was actually his enemy. The longer the search took, the more opportunities Margaret would have to locate and eliminate heirs before they could establish their claims. He needed to accelerate his efforts, which meant taking risks that might expose his investigation to people who had every reason to want it stopped. In early 1865, as the Confederacy collapsed and Union victory became inevitable, Whitfield made a decision that would determine the outcome of the entire inheritance battle. He published advertisements in northern newspapers aimed at refugee communities, describing the missing heirs and asking anyone with information to come forward. The advertisements were deliberately vague about the inheritance value to avoid attracting fraudulent claims, but they provided enough detail that anyone who genuinely matched the descriptions might recognize themselves. The gamble worked better than Whitfield hoped, and worse than Margaret feared, because among the people who responded to those advertisements were individuals who remembered details about the missing heirs that only someone who had been at Riverside Plantation in 1859 could possibly know. But the advertisements also alerted Margaret that her time was running out, and she responded by doubling her investment in hunters who could find the remaining heirs before Whitfield did. The race to locate 23 stolen children had become a race between justice and murder, and nobody could predict which side would reach the finish line first. On January 12, 1870, exactly 48 days before the deadline, when unclaimed shares of the Crosby inheritance would revert to Margaret's white sons, Thomas Whitfield stood in a Charleston courtroom holding sworn affidavits from 7 living heirs and death certificates for 4 others who had been murdered under circumstances suspicious enough to warrant criminal investigation if South Carolina authorities had any interest in justice for people of color, which they demonstrably did not. Margaret Crosby sat across the room in expensive mourning clothes she still wore, despite her husband being dead for 11 years. Her face composed in an expression of dignified grief that concealed the satisfaction she felt, knowing that 16 of the 23 heirs remained unlocated and therefore unable to claim their inheritance, which meant that more than 2/3 of Henry's fortune would return to her family, regardless of what the court decided about the 7 who had been found. But what Margaret did not know, what Whitfield had deliberately kept hidden until this moment, when revealing it, would cause maximum legal and psychological damage, was that one of those 7 heirs carried documentation that would transform the entire case from a property dispute into a criminal conspiracy that even a sympathetic South Carolina court could not completely ignore. The hearing was technically a probate matter, a routine proceeding to determine whether certain individuals qualified as legitimate heirs under Henry Crosby's will. Judge Samuel Harrison, a 58-year-old veteran of South Carolina's planter class who had lost 2 sons fighting for the Confederacy, made no secret of his contempt for the entire proceeding. He had accepted the case only because federal Reconstruction authorities were monitoring South Carolina courts for evidence of discrimination against freed people, and refusing to hear a properly filed inheritance claim would have triggered unwanted federal intervention. Whitfield presented his evidence methodically. He began with Sarah, now 29 years old, who testified about her childhood at Riverside Plantation, her sale to Texas in 1859, and her reunion with Whitfield in 1863. She produced her original manumission papers, signed by Henry Crosby in 1853 when she was 13 years old, which proved her legal status as a free person of color, entitled to inherit property. She identified photographs of Riverside that Whitfield had obtained, describing specific locations and events that only someone who had lived there could know. Margaret's attorney, a Charleston lawyer named Preston Wade, who specialized in defending white families against claims by freed people, attempted to discredit Sarah's testimony by questioning her memory after 11 years and suggesting that Whitfield had coached her to memorize details from documents. But Sarah's responses were too specific, too detailed, and too emotionally authentic to be fabrications. She remembered the smell of her mother's cooking in the main house kitchen. She described the layout of the slave quarters with precision that matched plantation records. And when Wade asked her to prove she was Henry Crosby's daughter, she removed a locket from around her neck that contained a miniature portrait of a young white man that Whitfield identified as Henry Crosby at age 25. "My mother gave this to me the night before Mrs. Crosby sold me away," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the tears on her face. "She told me to never forget who my father was, and to never let anyone make me ashamed of my blood." Judge Harrison examined the locket and the portrait inside it. The resemblance between the painted face and confirmed photographs of Henry Crosby was undeniable. He admitted the locket as evidence and moved to the next heir. Whitfield called 3 more witnesses over the following 2 days. Hannah Crosby, now 18 years old, who had been 8 when sold to Virginia, and had survived by working as a house servant for a Richmond family until Union forces occupied the city in 1865. The twins, Thomas and Mary, both 22, who had been separated at age 12 and reunited by pure chance in 1867 when they encountered each other at a Freedmen's Bureau office in Kentucky, where both had gone seeking help locating family members. Each provided testimony, documentation, and personal details that corroborated their identities as Henry Crosby's children. But it was the 5th heir who transformed the case from a property dispute into something far more dangerous for Margaret. His name was Daniel Crosby, age 17, one of the younger children who had been only 7 when Margaret sold him to a Mississippi plantation in 1859, under the false name William Carter. Daniel had been found by one of Whitfield's contacts in late 1869, just months before the inheritance deadline, and what made his testimony devastating was not just his identity, but what he had witnessed. Daniel testified that in August 1869, he had been approached by a white man who identified himself as working for the Crosby family in South Carolina. The man had offered Daniel money to sign a document stating that he had no claim to any inheritance and that he acknowledged being properly purchased as a slave in 1859. When Daniel refused, the man threatened him, stating that other heirs who had refused similar offers had met with unfortunate accidents. Whitfield then produced a document that stunned the courtroom. It was a letter written by Margaret Crosby to a man named Jacob Trent, dated July 1869, discussing payments for ensuring that problematic claims are resolved before the deadline in a manner that protects family interests. The letter was signed by Margaret and included specific amounts of money to be paid for successful resolutions. Preston Wade immediately objected, demanding to know how Whitfield had obtained private correspondence between his client and a third party. Whitfield's response was carefully worded to avoid admitting anything that might compromise his source. But the implication was clear. Someone close to Margaret's operation had provided the letter, because they could not stomach what Margaret was ordering Trent to do. "Your Honor," Whitfield said, "this letter demonstrates that Mrs. Crosby has been actively working to prevent legitimate heirs from claiming their inheritance through means that include intimidation, bribery, and based on other evidence I am prepared to present, actual violence resulting in death." He then introduced evidence about Isaac Crosby's death in 1863, showing that Isaac had been killed just days before his scheduled meeting with Whitfield, and that the investigation into his death had been perfunctory at best. He provided testimony from witnesses who had seen strangers asking questions about Isaac's location in the days before his death. And he connected these strangers to Jacob Trent through financial records showing payments from Margaret to Trent during the same period. Judge Harrison's expression shifted from contemptuous boredom to genuine concern. Murder conspiracies involving prominent white families were different from simple property disputes about freed people's inheritance claims. If Whitfield could prove that Margaret had ordered killings to prevent heirs from claiming their rights, the case would become a criminal matter that could attract federal attention and potentially result in prosecution under Reconstruction laws protecting freed people from violent intimidation. Margaret's composure finally cracked. She stood abruptly, ignoring Preston Wade's attempt to restrain her, and addressed the court directly. "These accusations are outrageous. I have done nothing except protect my family's property from fraudulent claims by people who were never my husband's children and who have been coached by this abolitionist agitator to memorize stories that match documents he has forged." Whitfield responded instantly. "Then why, Mrs. Crosby, did you sell all 23 heirs out of South Carolina within months of your husband's death? Why did you change their names and destroy plantation records documenting their births? Why did you hire Jacob Trent to locate them, once my advertisements made it clear that some would be found despite your efforts? I sold property that belonged to me. I have no knowledge of any Jacob Trent or any letters this court may have been shown, and I deeply resent the implication that I would harm anyone, let alone children, over a property dispute. Then you acknowledge that you sold the heirs." Margaret realized her mistake too late. Preston Wade stood quickly and requested a recess to confer with his client. Judge Harrison granted it, but the damage was done. Margaret had admitted to selling the heirs, which contradicted her earlier position that they were not her husband's children at all. The trial resumed 2 days later, with Preston Wade arguing that even if the heirs' identities could be proven, only 7 of 23 had been located before the deadline, which meant that 16 shares would revert to Margaret's sons regardless. Whitfield countered that the reason so many heirs had not been found was directly attributable to Margaret's criminal actions in selling them under false identities and then actively preventing their location through intimidation and violence. Judge Harrison was caught in an impossible position. The evidence suggested that Margaret had indeed conspired to prevent legitimate heirs from claiming their inheritance, which was fraud and possibly worse. But accepting that conclusion would require a South Carolina court in 1870 to rule against a prominent white widow in favor of mixed-race freed people, which would outrage the very constituency that Harrison depended on for his political survival. The judge's ruling, delivered on February 20, 1870, 8 days before the inheritance deadline, was a masterpiece of legal compromise that satisfied neither side but allowed Harrison to avoid taking a definitive position on the most inflammatory questions. He ruled that the 7 heirs who had been located and who had provided sufficient evidence of their identities were entitled to their shares of the Crosby estate. But he also ruled that the 16 unlocated heirs had failed to establish claims before the deadline, and therefore their shares would revert to Robert, James, and William Crosby as residual beneficiaries. Furthermore, Judge Harrison found insufficient evidence to support criminal charges related to Isaac's death or to prove that Margaret had ordered violence against other heirs. The letter to Jacob Trent was ruled inadmissible on technical grounds related to how it had been obtained. And without that letter, the testimony about intimidation and threats was merely he said, she said between parties, with obvious interests in the outcome. The practical result was that 7 heirs would divide approximately 30% of Henry Crosby's estate, while Margaret's sons would inherit the remaining 70%. Sarah, Hannah, Daniel, Thomas, Mary, and 2 others who had provided statements but had not testified in person would each receive roughly $80,000 in 1870 currency plus shares of certain property holdings. It was substantial money that would allow them to establish independent lives, but it was a fraction of what Henry had intended them to receive. Margaret had won. Not completely, because 7 heirs claiming any portion of the estate represented a partial failure of her plan. But she had successfully prevented 16 heirs from coming forward, had protected the majority of the family wealth for her sons, and had avoided any criminal consequences for the methods she employed. She left the courthouse on February 20th, knowing that she had sacrificed her soul to preserve her family's fortune, and the expression on her face suggested she considered it a fair trade. But Thomas Whitfield was not finished. As he watched Margaret's carriage depart from the courthouse, he made a decision that would ensure her victory was only temporary. He gathered every document related to the Crosby case, the original will, the manumission papers, his notes on the missing 16 heirs, copies of the inadmissible letter, testimony transcripts, everything, and he deposited them in a sealed archive at the Charleston Historical Society, with instructions that they be preserved indefinitely and made available to researchers after his death. One day, he believed, the full truth would matter. One day, the descendants of those 16 missing heirs might be found and might deserve to know what had been stolen from their ancestors. One day, justice might arrive, even if he would not live to see it. He just never imagined it would take 150 years. Martha Johnson was scrolling through her ancestry DNA results on a slow Tuesday afternoon in March 2018 when she noticed something statistically impossible. More than 2,000 people in the database shared identical segments of DNA, suggesting they all descended from the same white ancestor in South Carolina approximately 6 generations back. But none of them appeared in each other's family trees, and most had no idea they were related until the algorithm flagged the connections. What made this genetic cluster even more extraordinary was that every single person in it was African American, which meant that somewhere in the 1800s, a white man in South Carolina had fathered enough children with enslaved women to create a bloodline that now included thousands of descendants scattered across America, who had been living their entire lives unaware that they were cousins sharing a common legacy of wealth, violence, an inheritance theft that was about to explode into the largest reparations case in modern legal history. Martha, a 53-year-old genealogist who specialized in helping black families trace roots severed by slavery, recognized immediately that she was looking at evidence of something massive, something deliberately hidden, something that would change lives the moment she started asking the right questions. Martha began her investigation the way she always did, by building a family tree backward from the present. She contacted several people from the DNA cluster, asking them what they knew about their South Carolina ancestors. Most knew very little beyond a few generations. Slavery had destroyed record-keeping for black families, leaving gaps that DNA could identify but not explain. But patterns emerged. Multiple people mentioned ancestors who had been sold away from South Carolina between 1859 and 1860. Several recalled family stories about a plantation called Riverside. A few remembered elderly relatives mentioning the name Crosby, though context was usually vague or contradictory. Martha cross-referenced these fragments with historical records. She found census data, plantation documents, and sale records that confirmed Riverside Plantation's existence and its ownership by Henry Crosby. She found Henry's death record from 1859, and then, digging through digitized archives at the Charleston Historical Society, she found something that made her hands shake as she read it. Thomas Whitfield's complete file on the Crosby inheritance case, donated in 1883 per his will, and finally digitized in 2017 as part of a grant-funded preservation project. The file contained everything: Henry's original will acknowledging 23 children and leaving them his fortune, the manumission papers proving they were legally free, Margaret's systematic sale of all 23 heirs to prevent them from claiming their inheritance, the 1870 trial where 7 heirs were found and 16 remained missing, and most importantly, Whitfield's detailed notes describing each of the 16 unlocated heirs, their names, approximate ages when sold, physical descriptions, and what little information he had gathered about where they might have been taken. Martha spent 3 months cross-referencing Whitfield's notes with the DNA cluster data and the fragmentary family histories she had collected. The connections she made were stunning in their clarity. The 2,000 people in the DNA cluster were descendants of Henry Crosby's 23 children. Most descended from the 16 heirs who had never been found, who had lived and died without knowing about their inheritance, and who had passed down genes but not knowledge of their true origins. In June 2018, Martha published her findings in a genealogy journal article titled "The Lost Heirs of Riverside: How DNA Solved a 150-Year-Old Inheritance Mystery." The article included family trees connecting hundreds of living people to specific Crosby heirs, documentary evidence from Whitfield's file, and legal analysis suggesting that the 1870 court ruling might be challengeable under modern law because it was based on the heirs' inability to come forward, which was directly caused by Margaret Crosby's criminal actions. The article generated immediate attention. Major newspapers picked up the story. Television news programs interviewed Martha and several descendants who had no idea of their connection to the Crosby inheritance until DNA and genealogy revealed it. And within weeks, multiple law firms specializing in civil rights cases and class action litigation began contacting descendants to discuss whether a modern lawsuit could recover compensation for an inheritance theft that occurred 159 years earlier. The legal question was complex and unprecedented. Could descendants of heirs who lost an inheritance in 1870 sue for compensation in 2018? The original heirs were all dead. The original defendants were dead. The Crosby fortune had been dissipated through generations of inheritance and investment. But modern law had provisions for recovering stolen property even after long periods. And some legal scholars argued that inheritance rights might not expire the same way criminal charges did. In March 2019, a consortium of civil rights attorneys filed a class action lawsuit in federal court in South Carolina on behalf of approximately 2,000 descendants of the 16 unlocated Crosby heirs. The defendants were the current owners of properties that had once been part of the Crosby estate, banks that had managed trust accounts derived from Crosby wealth, and the estate of Margaret Crosby's last surviving direct descendant, who had died in 2003, leaving a substantial fortune built on assets traceable to the 1870 inheritance reversion. The lawsuit argued that the 1870 court ruling was the product of fraud and criminal conspiracy. Margaret had deliberately sold the heirs under false identities, with the specific intent of preventing them from claiming their inheritance. She had then hired agents to intimidate and possibly murder heirs who were found before the deadline. The court had admitted the fraudulent basis of her actions while simultaneously rewarding her by allowing her sons to inherit the unclaimed shares. Modern descendants should not be penalized for actions that 19th century courts had facilitated through institutional racism and inadequate justice. The defendants countered that 150 years was far too long to maintain any legal claim. The statute of limitations had expired multiple times over. The original heirs had failed to establish their claims when required by the will's terms. Current property owners had purchased their holdings in good faith, without knowledge of century-old controversies. Allowing this lawsuit to proceed would create chaos in property law by suggesting that any inheritance from the 19th century could be challenged based on newly discovered evidence about the original circumstances. The case wound through federal court for 3 years, generating hundreds of briefs, dozens of hearings, and intense media coverage that sparked national debates about reparations, inherited wealth, and whether historical injustices could or should be remedied through modern legal systems. The descendants were divided among themselves about whether to pursue the case or accept a settlement offer. The defendants were facing potential liability in the hundreds of millions if DNA evidence and historical documents could prove direct lineage to the 16 unlocated heirs. In August 2022, the federal judge overseeing the case issued a ruling that attempted to balance competing interests while establishing new precedent for similar future cases. She ruled that the descendants did have standing to sue despite the passage of time, because fraud and criminal conspiracy had prevented the original heirs from asserting their rights. However, she also ruled that recovering actual property was impossible given how thoroughly the original estate had been dissipated through legitimate transactions over 150 years. The remedy she ordered was compensatory. The defendants would jointly contribute to a settlement fund of $47 million to be divided among proven descendants of the 16 unlocated heirs. The amount was calculated based on what those heirs would have inherited in 1870, adjusted for inflation and conservative investment returns over the intervening decades. It was a fraction of what the full estate might have grown to worth under optimal circumstances, but it was substantial enough to provide real economic benefit to the descendants, while not destroying the defendants financially. The settlement was finalized in December 2023. By mid-2024, more than 1,800 descendants had provided sufficient DNA and genealogical evidence to qualify for payment. Each received approximately $26,000, plus participation in a charitable trust established to fund education and business development for the descendant community. Martha Johnson attended the settlement distribution ceremony in Charleston in July 2024. She watched as descendants who had never met before embraced as newly discovered cousins. She heard stories about how the settlement money would pay off debts, fund education, start businesses, and provide security that generations of systemic discrimination had denied these families. But the moment that affected her most deeply came when she was shown a letter that had been discovered in the Crosby family papers during litigation discovery. It was written by Margaret Crosby in 1895, 5 years before her death, addressed to her granddaughter. I have lived 40 years with the consequences of choices I made after your grandfather's death. I did what I believed necessary to preserve our family's position and wealth. The law supported my actions, even when morality questioned them. I sold 23 children to protect 3 of my own sons. I hired men to ensure those children could never claim what your grandfather wished them to have. I won every legal battle. And yet I have been defeated by something no court could rule on: memory. I see their faces still, particularly the youngest, Elijah, who was only 2 when I sent him away. He cried for his mother, and I told him she would be waiting where he was going. He believed me because children that age believe everything adults tell them. I wonder if he ever forgave the lie when he was old enough to understand that I had taken everything from him. Your grandfather wanted those children to inherit because he believed they were as much his as my sons were mine. I could not accept that. I still cannot accept it fully, though I understand it better now after 4 decades of watching my own sons and their children build lives on a foundation that was supposed to be shared with people whose existence we erased. You will inherit what we preserved. You will live in comfort because I was ruthless. I pray you will also inherit wisdom to question whether what I did to secure that comfort was worth the cost, because I no longer know the answer, and I fear I will carry that uncertainty into whatever judgment awaits me. The letter was read aloud at the settlement ceremony by Margaret's great-great-granddaughter, a white woman in her 40s who had joined the descendant community's celebration to offer apology on behalf of her ancestor. Her voice broke multiple times while reading, and when she finished, she was embraced by descendants of the very children Margaret had sold 165 years earlier. Martha Johnson understood in that moment that the settlement was not just about money. It was about acknowledgement. It was about descendants of the 16 lost heirs finally having their existence and their rightful claim recognized after more than a century of being erased from history. It was about proving that injustice could be documented, challenged, and at least partially remedied, even when the original perpetrators and victims were long dead. The Crosby inheritance case established legal precedent that would influence dozens of subsequent reparations claims. It demonstrated that DNA evidence combined with historical records could prove lineage across centuries. It showed that courts could fashion remedies for historical injustices if the underlying facts were sufficiently documented. And it gave Martha Johnson and 2,000 descendants something that no amount of money could fully compensate. Knowledge of who they were, where they came from, and what had been stolen from their ancestors. Thomas Whitfield had preserved the truth for 150 years in a sealed archive, believing that someday it would matter. In July 2024, as descendants of the lost heirs gathered in Charleston to receive their settlement checks and meet newly discovered family members, his faith was finally vindicated. Justice had arrived late, incomplete, and mediated through modern legal systems that Whitfield could never have imagined. But it had arrived. And that was enough to prove that some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how many people try to erase them from history.